All right. So back to science class for some of us for a second. We probably recognize the biological classifications that are there. Domain at the top level of life, kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, and species, right? That's kind of the way it goes, okay? And what I'm looking at here, and the arrow might show, is that's kind of specificity. We're getting more and more specific. At the top level, we're talking, everything's in the animal kingdom, or everything here. And then it's, getting more and more specific as you get down there. And just keep that in mind as we walk through this, because you notice throughout that passage that we've looked at so far, he keeps mentioning according to their kind, according to their kind, according to their kind. That's an important distinction that we will try to evaluate here, because that helps us to know how many animals were on the ark. That another debate out there in the world of skeptics and atheists and whatever is, there's no way Noah could ever fit all those millions of animals on the ark. Okay, no one said there was millions of animals. The Bible didn't say it. It said every animal according to its kind. So let's talk about, we'll have to take a detour here for a moment. Let's talk about what kind of animals were on the ark and how much animal space was needed on the ark. Okay. So that's got a little overwritten there, but anyway, so we talked about this before, but there's this field of study within creation science called baraminologists, or baraminology, right? Bara is that word that we've talked about where God directly created on days 1 through 6 of creation. He spoke things into existence. So that kind that God spoke into existence, bara, and the study of the baraminology, of the study of the created kinds, the best as we can do. Okay, so they have estimated, and as I keep mentioning, they overestimate the number of unique animal kinds would have been about 1,398, or just under 1,400 created kinds. Okay, not billions, not millions, not tens of thousands, but 1,400 created kinds. They also generally equate a biblical kind at the family level, right? So if I go back to this for a second, not at the species level, but at the kind level. Though, like I said, not all varieties of cats, just 2 representative, original created kinds of cats that have all of the genetic variability built within them so that later on they can speciate. They can go out and populate the world in different environments with different conditions and different all kinds of things. Sometimes they talk about it, but maybe it's at the genus level, but it's really at the family level. You don't need 400 varieties of dogs or 400 varieties of cats or 400 varieties of horses or whatever else. You just need 2 representative kinds, because that's what God started with on day 6 in the garden, or on the earth, and we're going to do the same thing after the ark all over again. Go away, please. All right. And so one of the tests of all of this, you can study this all you like, one of the tests is really, can they naturally interbreed? Okay. Can a horse and a zebra create a zorse? Yes, they can. If they have the genetic capability of interbreeding within the species level, then they are of the same created kind. Okay. And so that's what we're looking at. And there's all kinds of examples. In fact, the Ark Encounter has a zorse on property. You can go look at a hybrid mix between a horse and a zebra. That's not something they just did on a whim. They didn't create, let's go get a zorse, or take a horse and a zebra and make a zorse. They do this naturally, either in zoos or in the wild, and you can find them. Now, of course, you get to some of the offspring are sterile, they can't reproduce, but not all. Some of them can reproduce as they drift further and further away from that, sort of the speciation level that they have. Okay. So it helps us understand that's how they've come about. They spent many years and many, many hours of faithful, God-honoring kind of research to come up with how many created kinds of these categories of land-breathing, air-breathing, land-dwelling animals would be necessary to be on the ark. They're always overestimating, but you get to a number of about 1,400. So while, of course, numbers continue to change, there's actually, if you talk about the species, people say, how do you fit all those millions of species on the ark or whatever? There's actually about 1.8 million total species on the earth on some study in the last 5 or 10 years or whatever, right? I mean, numbers always changing. And they're always willing to bifurcate and change this thing that they thought was one into two different kinds or species or whatever. But let's say roughly 1.8, no more than 2 million species have been identified and cataloged and all of that into the whole animal kingdom. Over 98% of that 1.8 million are represented by fish, invertebrates, plants, or bacteria. Okay? So none of those were on the ark. Okay? So there's 1.8 million species that we're not even worried about, where we're actually talking about created kinds. But even if you're talking about 1.8 million species, 98% would not be an animal that's needed to be on the ark because it's not included in the list that God gave to Noah. Okay. The remaining, therefore, land-dependent, air-breathing species, not even kinds, drops to only about 34,000 based on those representative numbers. There's 34,000 species of land-dwelling, air-breathing type animals that would be included in Noah's mandate to include them on the ark. But we're talking species, not kinds yet. Okay. At the kind level, as we already mentioned, only about 1,400 animal types were represented. So now you need pairs, so that's 2,800. But some of them, of course, were clean animals, so you need sevens for those, would be required in order to fulfill God's mandate to fulfill the ark. So Answers in Genesis, AIG, overestimates, again, as I said before, using worst case projections, and they're not the only ones. I think Institute for Creation Research does this, same other kinds of Biblical Science Institute, others, Creation Ministries International. You can probably get the same basic kind of information through their own independent studies, not like they're stealing from each other. Get about the same kind of numbers here. So with these worst case projections, about 6,750 animals or less would have been on the ark. Now, most of these animals are really small. Okay, I mean the average, sort of let's say the mean, or is that the right word? Sort of the midpoint size would be a sheep, let's say. Okay, doesn't mean the average, the total, everything is either above or below a sheep, but some of them are really big, and some of them are super small. Sort of that midpoint, median point, or whatever in there is like a sheep. Okay, size of sheep. Still not very large when you talk about the size of the ark. But the bulk of these animals would be very small, and we'll talk about the other inference as well. So most animals are very small, very easily cared for, occupy very minimal space. Regardless if it's 7, 14, or 2, they're going to not take up that much space as a quantity of animals on the ark. It is inferred, and I think properly inferred, I would agree with this, and all of these agencies that work on this do the same thing, that fully mature of animals of that giant variety would not be brought to Noah. Okay, thinking giraffes or elephants or huge dinosaurs. Now, I believe there's space, and we talked about that. You could have a 35-foot tall deck if you didn't equally space them out and all that. So you could have a giraffe. He doesn't have to spin there with his neck all bent down, but we don't even think that a giraffe like you and I see in a zoo would be on the ark, because it would be the kind that had the short neck until after the ark. But elephants or even huge dinosaurs, and there were dinosaurs on the ark, okay, because they weren't entirely wiped out then, but a huge part of them were. But you would not bring the mature ones. You would bring juveniles, smaller. Okay, so juveniles are the smaller ones we brought on. Why would is God smart enough to bring the right size animal on the ark? Well, you're going to bring a great big elephant or a great big giraffe or a great big dinosaur. What's it need? A whole lot of food, a whole lot of water. It's going to produce a whole lot of waste. And unfortunately, it's going to have a lot shorter reproductive lifespan ahead of it after it leaves the ark than a juvenile one. So I think we would rightly suspect that God would bring juveniles fully capable of surviving on their own, but not the great big ones that you see in the zoo or on dinosaur movies or in dinosaur books. You're talking about, or in natural earth museums or whatever, natural history museums, you're talking about probably juveniles, which are much smaller. We talked about this last time. You got an egg of a dinosaur, the largest dinosaur in the world that we all have any knowledge of. You can hold this egg in your hand. And so it's you bring a juvenile on board, and it's he and his female. Well, that's a whole lot less space, a whole lot less food, a whole lot less water, a whole lot less waste to have to deal with. Okay. So we believe, and this comes out of these, again, Ark books and whatnot, Ark Encounter Signs and all that, is where I pulled the information from. It's not mine. So from Answers in Genesis, the interior capacity of the Ark is they equate it to 447 tractor trailer size cars or boxes, right? The semi trucks that would haul in goods and whatever. 447 of them would technically, or at least the capacity of them, would fit inside the Ark. That's pretty large capacity. Okay, but they estimated that they would also need to store 322,400 gallons of water, some of which they could replenish through rainwater collection and all that. They would need to store 400 tons of grains or seeds or nuts and maybe preserved fruits and vegetables on the Ark. Okay, but it all fits. They look at it in these books, or you go to Kentucky or wherever else, look at videos online, whatever. It all fits, and with ample space, okay, for those 7,000 animals or whatever. They needed 22. They estimated 22 extra large animal cages, 186 large cages, 293 medium-sized cages, 308 bird cages, 174 small cages, and 415 amphibian cages. And they're not even sure if amphibians would be included in this whole thing or not, because amphibians might be able to survive on rafts that created by fallen trees and whatnot, floating out there, and they can eat some insects that are, there's possibility that you don't even need the amphibians, but they're not that big, so you can clearly, easily include them on the Ark. Well, of course, with big ships, we talk about displacement. How much would it displace? But I don't know if I've seen an estimate on that. But it would be a lot. But but as I mentioned last week, naval architects have looked at the Ark and said it is an incredibly seaworthy craft. And so you load it up with all these supplies, and you've got ample, buoyancy in order to make it work, as well as ample space inside to hold it all. Yeah.
All I can think of is, with all of this stuff going on, the noise in that Definitely.
The noise, the smells, it was, they were saved. They were being saved for a new purpose and a new life, and each and every one of those people, well, of the men at least, have notable names that have survived throughout all history. But would you want to be on the Ark? You would for survival, but it would be noisy, it would be smelly, it would be, while it was seaworthy, it was not a cruise line. It was probably still a bumping and a moving all the time, and rocking and rolling, and there was lots of storms. No one would probably think that they had an enjoyable time. But as far as that last part, the Ark came to rest on the mountains near Ararat, 150 days in. So they weren't bouncing and bobbing and weaving on the ocean for the whole year. About little less than half a year, they were actually floating. But yeah, boy, lots of work, lots of cleaning up. There's been times I thought, wouldn't it be fun to go, work in maybe not a zoo, but an aquarium or something. Then you go through those places and you go, the smell is just overpowering. Yeah, that seems like fun. Anyway, so I'm sure it was a quite an experience for our 8 intrepid travelers there. So. All right, so moving on. So back into the text, chapter 7, verse 17. Okay. So it actually talks, so now they're in the ark, they're all provided for. Now we're going to talk about them living through the judgment floodwaters. So now the flood was on the earth for 40 days, or that's the period of buildup. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. And the waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. And the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. It was not just static, it was moving, floating, drifting along. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. And all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle, and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, and all that was on dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him on the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Okay, so I'm just getting you to the point where he's now been floating on the waters, a completely flooded and destroyed earth, and then his ark comes to rest in these mountain areas of Ararat, and that much time has passed. So that's all we'll attempt to cover tonight. We'll pick up him leaving the ark and all that happens after that, the renewed earth, like I said, in like 3 weeks, because the next 2 weeks we're not meeting. All right, so the global flood began in, as we know now, the 600th year in the 2nd month, we're now told, 2nd month of the year on the 17th day of the month. So we'll just keep that as a marker point. We'll talk about it in a minute. The fountains of the great deep were broken up like the rupturing of a great big dam. Okay, what if Grand Coulee Dam or Chief Joe Dam or down in Arizona the Hoover Dam and all that? What if these massive reservoirs of water just exploded, just ruptured to the point where full breach of the dam happened? That's kind of the picture that we're talking about here. We're not talking about a little trickle of water or whatever. We're talking about God had these reservoirs of water stored under the earth, and he's now rupturing their containment, and they are now flooding all over all of the earth. Okay. So additionally, the windows of heaven were opened up, or the word there means let loose, like he's letting loose all these windows of heaven, whatever waters are stored up in heaven. So it's coming from 2 directions. Okay, there's water stored way down deep that had not overpowered the land wherever it was stored, and you've got clouds or rainwaters up above and wherever they're obtaining the water from, and he's deluging the earth from above and below. There's no way of escape. There's no place where it's not just a little water, but there's no place where it's not a torrential and all-encompassing level of water that is now pummeling the earth based on this instantaneous judgment that God is bringing about. All right, additionally, the windows of heaven were open, so then there was certainly water available before the flood. Obviously, mankind and all animals had access to water before the flood, but they had never seen anything like this. Okay, we don't know, and I'm guessing, despite all kinds of conjectures out there, my guess is we probably really never saw true rain on the earth up until this day, the 600th year and 2nd month of Noah's life. Okay. probably never truly saw rain. We saw this mist that came up. We know there's rivers of water flowing out from the Garden of Eden and all of that, and everything is cared for and provided by water. But God had these treasuries of water above and below the earth that he knew he would need for this moment in time, and he lets both of them loose, and they come and they flood the earth. Okay. Which also will answer later, where did the waters go? Well, if he had the ability to store them before the flood, he has the ability to store them after the flood. Okay. And completely change the continents and all that as well. But in an instant, like many animals as well as mankind were now in a futile struggle for survival that one way or another they're going to ultimately lose no matter how they might have tried to survive. Some of the stronger, more agile, or even larger animals may have been able to scramble up to higher levels of terrain to sort of get away from it. The water's coming down, but they're not totally drowned or buried yet. But some of those less mobile animals, certainly single-celled organisms and trilobites and various other things, and most of the fossil record is trilobites and fish, right? And so they just didn't have any way of escape. They just got buried. Not just with water, but by now it's stirring up all of that sediment, and it's starting to, we're going to see pancake layer upon layer all of those animals. And yes, some of them will go up to higher ground and survive. Obviously, some of them, whether they're old or whether they don't have the mobility, or maybe a mom caring for its offspring is unable to survive as well as maybe a male in its very large size climbing up to the top of a mountain. And that's what really, and we'll talk about this again in a few weeks, but that's what really creates those layers, those different layers of animals and fossils that you see out there, is more based on their ability to survive for days or weeks, not when they emerged onto the evolutionary world scene. Okay. So research suggests that 95%, so no, what we're talking about here is this fossilization. Now, I think everybody probably knows, you don't just get fossils because something dies, right? You get fossils because of a rapid burial under incredibly high-pressure environments that absolutely bury these fossils, right? And you've probably seen some pictures, maybe I can get some for next time, like a fish eating another fish, okay? It's fossilized in the process of eating its dinner, okay? There's another one of is it a fish or something else, giving birth, right? It's right in the middle. The baby is still coming out of its mother's environment, and both of them get fossilized in an instant, right? We are talking about instantaneous fossilization, okay? And so, but in other cases, and then you see, but then there's still, it's not just like it got buried and fossilized. In some cases, it got buried, but then the floodwaters keep churning up, and we take the skull of an animal and we throw it way over there, and we take the femur bones or whatever, and we throw it way over there. I mean, it's just this rapid ripping apart, body parts kind of everywhere. Some of them get buried here, some of them get buried there. If you don't know, it's very, 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 very rare to find a fully intact fossilized animal. Certainly one of any kind of size. Most of what you might see in a natural museum, history of natural history museum, something like that, natural history museum, they're piecing together stuff that they don't really know if it 100% fits together or if it came from the same animal or not. They're just going, well, it looks like it might work. Now, there are some really great specimens, but most of what we see are very small fragments that have to sort of be put back together based on a scientific interpretation of the data, or assumptions based on the data. Anyway, so 95% of fossils that are discovered are marine life. Okay? 95% are marine life because they had the best fossilization opportunities of anything that was out there. They're in the water environment, these floodwaters are coming down and they're burying them, and they get into a fossilized state. 95% are marine life, not earth-based life like we see surviving on the ark. Now, obviously, we have plenty of really nice sampling of fossils that we can say that were air-breathing, land-dwelling animals, but that only represents 5%. all those books about dinosaurs and all that stuff that you see, and woolly mammoths or whatever else, is a very small representation of the total animal kingdom that has been fossilized, because again, most of it is aquatic. And you see aquatic fossils everywhere on the globe. Tops of mountains, right in the middle of vast desert, Sahara Desert, wherever it is, you'll find marine fossils everywhere across the globe. Okay. All right. So the increasing waters of the flood continued relentlessly for 40 days and for 40 nights. That was all it took to completely devastate and destroy the entire world. 40 days and 40 nights. After that, I think you're seeing God allowing the earth to sort of settle under its new processes, so he waits for 150 days, and then he's going to let the waters begin to recede at a controlled level as the earth is now ready for repopulation. Okay, but soon we're going to see the massive ark. So the 40 days and for 40 nights, at the beginning, we're seeing this torrential rains coming, and we're seeing these fountains of the great deep open up. And I don't know if it was minutes or hours or a day or whatever, but suddenly this massive ark that had never touched water, or certainly a body of water, suddenly starts to lift up from the ground and float. Noah's must be going, hey, I built an ark. It's not sinking. It's not capsizing, right? It never had touched water until that time. Yeah, exactly. Whoa. Okay, so it's now it's rising up above the surface of the earth. Okay, it has its buoyancy. Whatever it was stationed on, some kind of stanchions or whatever it wasn't at a dock somewhere, right? It's lifting up, and it's ready to float high above the former surface of the earth. Obviously, the entire surface of the earth now is just water, but it's now above whatever land it was constructed on. Okay. So the scripture says that the waters prevailed and continued with this great deluge of water. Even the highest hills were covered in the floodwater, thus negating any possibility of a local flood. Okay. In order for a mountaintop to be covered in water, it has to surround the whole mountain, right? You can't just cover a mountain on one side of it and go, well, that's good enough. You're going to cover the mountain up over the top of the mountain. You have to cover the whole thing. Now you've got to cover up to the next mountain and to the next mountain or whatever until it all fills up, because water just finds its natural equilibrium, and it's not going to cover any mountaintops unless it can cover all those mountaintops. Right? It can't get that high to cover all of those things. Okay. So, yeah, as I said, any mountaintop to be fully covered, all of the geological formations below the peak must be first covered in water. And so if it's a nice high mountain and it's surrounded by a great big valley and whatever, it's got to fill up the whole thing before it fills up to the top of the mountain. If you don't believe me, go put something in your bathtub, that's nice and tall and got a nice top peak on it, and try to get it to the top without overflowing the bathtub. You're not going to do it because you have to fill up the whole thing to get over the top of the mountain. So once the tallest mountain peak on Earth is covered, it should clearly indicate no more dry land could possibly exist. And that's exactly what Scripture says. It covered it to the highest mountain. Okay? And then to reinforce how much water and how there was no land left on the earth to be seen, Scripture declares that the highest peaks were then covered by an additional 15 cubits of water, which I would calculate to 25 and a half feet. Okay, 25 and a half feet above the highest mountain peak. Now, I don't think that Mount Everest or K2 or anything like that were formed yet. Okay, those would come later, so we don't really know how high an elevation was needed. But obviously, the land that God created in the first 6 days of creation had mountains, had valleys, had peaks, had those kind of things. Everything else has been a complete shifting and restructuring of the earth since the global flood. You got volcanoes, and you got earthquakes, and you got the floodwaters, and you got all these things, and you're seeing, and you look at the geology books from creation scientists, how the earth would be pushing up these mountain ranges that we see here with Mount Everest or K2, or here in what's the tallest one here in Washington? Mount Olympia? Rainier. Rainier or Olympia or whatever, all of those are probably formed as a result of the global flood. They're not just a uncovered after the floodwaters receded kind of mountain range. Okay. All right, so this water depth would obviously ensure that the ark would not run aground during the initial phase of the flood. It's floating up. It would probably not be a good thing to run it into an iceberg or run it into a mountainside and rip a hole in the side of the ark, right? So it's raising it up above it so it's fully protected from any kind of damage as it floats along. So the non-aquatic life outside of the ark died. All non-aquatic life died outside in this catastrophic judgment. God already told us, birds and cattle and beasts, creeping things, mankind, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died and was destroyed. It leaves no ambiguity as to what happened here. If it wasn't on the ark and it needed to be for survival, it absolutely died. And that is a global judgment, a global event, as described in Scripture. So only Noah and those who were with him on the ark remained alive among those creatures that dwell on the earth. Okay. And the floodwaters prevailed, meaning they did not let up or recede for the first 150 days of this event, okay, into the 16th day of the 7th month. So it was the second month and the 17th day of the month. Now we've gone 150 days to the 16th day of the 7th month. Now I am using a 360-day calendar year because I think that's what the early chapters of Genesis, and even the Jewish system of lunar tracking of months would account for. So I'm going to use a 360-day, not a 365 and a quarter day or whatever kind of year to calculate this stuff. Okay. So God, it was at that time, in the 16th day of the 7th month, God, it says, remember. Don't you love it when it says God remembered, Noah or whatever? Don't think that God is being temporarily, forgetful about anything. It means he looked upon him. It means he was ready to turn his attention and take a new action for Noah at this time. Okay. He remembered him. He had love for him. He was ready to give him another blessing by turning the floodwaters into a blessing for him now. Okay. So he also remembered, it says, every living thing that was with Noah. So it wasn't just Noah, it was all that I have created is represented there on the ark, and I'm ready to let the ark come to pass where all the world can be repopulated again. So in order to do this, God made a wind to pass over the earth so that the waters that were previously increasing would now recede or begin to pull back. Okay, but it wasn't like an instantaneous. The flood wasn't instantaneous. It's sort of like a 40-day and 40-night buildup, and 150 to 150 total days of sort of letting it do its work on the earth. And now it's going to take some time, in fact, more time for the waters to subside and make a land suitable for Noah and his family again before it all occurs. Okay. So the fountains of the deep of heaven were all restrained from, so above and below were restrained from adding new water. There may have been water still available, but God restrained them. It was time to stop. And from this moment on, the floodwaters then begin to recede, though, as I said, what took 150 days to entirely flood and destroy the earth, is now going to take even more time, not a lot, but a little bit more time for it to fully recede back. Okay. So here's the timetable. The floodwaters prevailed for 150 days. On the 151st day, the ark came to rest there in those, not on Mount Ararat, and we don't even know Mount Ararat that we have today was even there when the ark came to rest. Again, lots of uplift and lots of new geological formations were occurring all after the flood, or in the middle of and after the flood. But it came in that area, what we would call Ararat, we think, but everybody's trying to find the ark on Mount Ararat, and it may not actually be on that mountain, okay, based on the text. So then we're going to see, we haven't gotten to this point yet, but on the 225th day, then Noah could look out the window of the ark and start to see some mountaintops. Okay, so there's the water. So for a long time, if he was looking out his window of the ark, you know what he saw? It was water, 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 nothing but water, and maybe blue sky and a sun, but nothing else. Okay. Now on the 225th day after he entered, or after the floodwaters started, he now sees the tops of mountains, but that's not very promising because you can't live on the top of a mountain, right? You can't do agriculture work on the top of a mountain. Then on what ends up being the 315th day, the waters dry up from the earth, okay? But the land is not fully dry, meaning it's a big mud puddle, right? And even though the water itself is gone, it's probably mud, not fully dried out, not ready to walk on yet. The land becomes fully dry on the 371st day. As I said, all of these dates that I gave you here are assuming a 360-day calendar, as I think is probably representative of what God is communicating in the text. Yeah?
So were there some rivers or some lakes or
Sure.
just totally dry?
No, there'd be oceans, there'd be rivers and lakes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, settling back into a environment that somewhat looks like what we see today. Now, we'll talk about some of the post-flood effects, but there would be after this because of the volcanic activity and because of the floodwaters and all that activity that's going on, you would have, I believe, very warm oceans and very cool environments, and so you're gonna create a global ice age. Okay, there was a global ice age that followed the flood, as creation scientists talk about. And so because of all that volcanic activity, there are warm oceans, and you got lots of evaporation. It's all this moisture is going up, and there's the ice age, and so all of this is going to change the geological landscape of everything we see. And so that would happen and there would be continued climate change for a couple of hundred years after the flood. And in fact, we really are still seeing today much less, but still seeing climate change as a result of the global flood of all of those events. Okay, so what it looked like specifically, I don't know, but there certainly would be oceans because all the aquatic life still needed a place to inhabit. There would probably almost certainly be rivers and all of that would be happening, and all of it the world that we know. We really don't have any experience until after the flood began. Whatever world Adam and Seth and Noah and the rest of the gang lived in may not have looked anything like the world we see today. The post-flood geology is much more equivalent to what we see today, but I don't want to say that every mountain range and every river and everything else that's not man-made was what Noah could have seen as he steps off the ark. There's still lots of changes that are coming about after the flood. Okay, yeah. And so that's what we have for tonight. And so 2 weeks off. See you on January 8th. But yeah, Kirk.